just a sleeping kid in seat 11D, until the captain asked, "Any combat pilot on board?" Families hugged goodbye, business people hurried with briefcases in hand, and young students laughed as they struggled to carry oversized backpacks. Amid all this motion, one young man moved quietly, almost unnoticed. He didn't carry a lot of luggage, only a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and wore simple clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a lightweight jacket. His hair was slightly messy, his eyes tired but calm. Most people wouldn't have given him a second glance. He moved through the terminal with a slow, deliberate pace, stopping occasionally to check the flight information screens. The gate for his flight wasn't far, and he didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had always preferred moving at his own pace, even if the world around him was moving too fast. As he approached the boarding area, the announcement for his flight came through the speakers. Flight 417 now boarding for all passengers. He nodded to himself and stepped forward. Once on the plane, he found his seat. 11D, it was by the window, the perfect spot to rest his head and watch the clouds roll by. As he settled into the seat, he pulled out a small travel pillow from his backpack and placed it behind his neck. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let out a quiet sigh. This was supposed to be just another routine flight, another journey like so many he had taken before. The hum of the plane, the faint smell of the cabin, and the occasional murmur of passengers were all familiar comforts. He reached for his headphones, slipping them over his ears. Music was his escape, a way to shut out the noise of the world and drift into his own thoughts. As the plane pushed back from the gate and the engines roared to life, he tilted his head against the pillow and allowed himself to relax completely. Around him, people chatted, laughed, and fidgeted in their seats, but he remained calm, almost invisible. To anyone looking, he was just another passenger, a sleeping kid in seat 11D, yet, beneath this quiet exterior, his mind was anything but idle. He had been trained for situations far beyond what most civilians could imagine. His years as a combat pilot had taught him discipline, patience, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. He had seen danger up close, made life-and-death decisions in a matter of seconds, and carried the weight of responsibility for not only his life, but the lives of others. And yet, here he was, trying to enjoy a simple flight, to live as someone ordinary. As the plane climbed into the sky, the city below shrank into a patchwork of buildings and roads, fading into the distance. The young man watched through the window for a few moments, noting the way the sunlight reflected off the clouds. There was a quiet beauty in the world from up here, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the chaos of his past life. He thought about how easy it was to blend in, to appear ordinary, even when you had a past filled with extraordinary experiences. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. The young man politely declined, shaking his head. He wasn't hungry, and he preferred to keep his attention inward to maintain this moment of calm. He noticed the variety of people on the flight. A mother soothing her crying child, an elderly couple holding hands tightly, a businessman typing away on his laptop, and a group of teenagers laughing loudly. Each person carried their own story, their own worries and joys. And for a few hours, they all shared this confined space, temporarily connected by the journey. He let his mind wander, thinking about his life after leaving the military. It had been an adjustment, trying to fit into a world that seemed slower, smaller, and less intense than what he had known. Simple tasks felt different now. Walking through a crowded street, sipping coffee at a cafe, or sitting quietly on a plane, each felt like a new experience, a chance to relearn life from the perspective of someone who had been trained for extremes. He appreciated these moments, the chance to observe life quietly without the constant demands of high-stakes missions. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of soft blues and gentle whites. He watched the clouds drift by, letting the motion lull him deeper into relaxation. The hum of the engines was steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing his thoughts to drift further. He thought about the friends he had made during his service, the camaraderie that came from shared experiences, the laughter in moments of relief, and the silent understanding in moments of danger. Those memories were a part of him, inseparable from who he was, even as he tried to embrace a quieter life now. The cabin of the plane carried on with its usual routine. People adjusted their seats, read books or magazines, and stared out the windows. The young man remained still, calm and composed. Occasionally, he would glance briefly at his fellow passengers, noting their reactions to the turbulence or the announcements. He had a trained eye for detail, a habit from his years in the cockpit, noticing things others might miss. The way someone gripped the armrest, the slight tension in a person's shoulders, the expressions of those lost in thought, all small observations that revealed more than words could. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, he allowed himself to drift further into rest. His breathing slowed, his body relaxed, and the music in his headphones created a private world of sound and rhythm. Outside, the clouds formed endless patterns, shifting slowly as the plane moved forward. It was a scene of peaceful monotony, the kind of ordinary moment that most people rarely pause to notice. But for him, even in this ordinary moment, there was a strange satisfaction. He was free here, free from expectations, free from the constant demands of a life that had once required so much from him. Despite the calm, there was a subtle awareness always present in him. He could sense tension, small vibrations, minor inconsistencies, habits ingrained from years of training. Even in the quiet hum of the plane, he remained attentive, ready to react if necessary. It was a strange balance, being able to rest fully while knowing that he could spring into action at a moment's notice. Most people would never understand the weight of that readiness, the constant presence of responsibility even in the simplest moments. He thought briefly about the future, wondering what lay ahead in this new chapter of his life. The transition from military life to civilian life was not easy. He missed some aspects of his past, the sense of purpose, the clear-cut missions, the camaraderie. But he also appreciated the ordinary pleasures he had once taken for granted. The sound of birds, the taste of a home-cooked meal, the comfort of routine. These small joys had taken on a new significance, a reminder that life could be meaningful even without constant danger or adrenaline. As the hours passed, the young man remained in his seat, a quiet observer of the world around him. He watched the subtle movements of passengers, listened to the snippets of conversation, and felt the gentle rise and fall of the plane. Each moment was ordinary, yet there was an unspoken beauty in it. He allowed himself to appreciate this normalcy, to exist without needing to prove anything, to simply be part of the world without the weight of expectations. Little did he know, this ordinary flight, this quiet moment of rest, was about to become extraordinary. In the next few hours, everything would change, and the world would suddenly notice the young man in seat 11D. But for now, he remained calm, relaxed, and unnoticed, a sleeping passenger among many, carrying a lifetime of experience quietly beneath the surface, ready for whatever the future might bring. And so the plane continued its journey, soaring through the sky. Passengers read, napped, or chatted quietly. The young man in 11D closed his eyes once more, the soft hum of the engines blending with the music in his headphones. In that ordinary, peaceful moment, he allowed himself to rest completely, unaware that soon his skills, courage, and training would be called upon in ways he could never have imagined. The flight continued smoothly for a while, the steady hum of the engines and the gentle rocking of the plane lulling many passengers into a relaxed state. Some were reading, others napped, and a few stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by like fluffy islands in a vast sky. The young man in seat 11D remained leaning against his pillow, headphones on, eyes closed, and mind partially wandering. He had almost convinced himself that this flight would pass as uneventfully as any other. But the ordinary calm did not last. Without warning, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed through the cabin, cutting through the gentle hum of the engines. The lights flickered for a brief moment, and the passengers' heads jerked up in alarm. Flight attendants quickly stood from their seats, their training kicking in as they moved down the aisles to reassure passengers, though even their calm faces betrayed a hint of concern. The young man in 11D immediately removed his headphones. His eyes opened slowly, scanning the cabin, noting the sudden tension. Something had changed. He could feel it instinctively. He had spent years in high-pressure situations, and even without being in a cockpit, his instincts told him that this was more than just a simple mechanical glitch. He straightened in his seat, alert, ready to act if necessary. A tense voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a mechanical issue. Please remain seated and stay calm. Flight attendants, take your positions." The voice was calm, almost too calm, and there was a tightness underneath the words that sent a ripple of unease through the passengers. Some murmured nervously, a few tried to laugh it off, but the unease was palpable. The young man's eyes met those of a nearby passenger, a mother clutching her child. The child's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered, "Mommy, what's happening?" The mother forced a reassuring smile, but her trembling hands betrayed her worry. The young man's gaze quickly returned to the front, to the cockpit, where he sensed the weight of responsibility pressing down like an invisible force. The captain's voice returned, this time more urgent. "Is there any combat pilot on board?" The announcement was brief, but it carried authority and desperation at the same time. The cabin fell silent. Passengers looked around at one another, unsure of how to respond. Some thought it must be a joke. Others glanced nervously at the flight attendants, searching for answers. But the young man in seat 11D stiffened immediately. For a moment, he simply stared at the ceiling, processing what had just been asked. His heart rate quickened, not with fear, but with the familiar surge of focus that always came before action. He had trained for emergencies like this many times in his life, simulated emergencies, high-stress combat situations, and even real-life life-or-death scenarios. The calm, ordinary world he had tried to embrace vanished instantly. There was no room for hesitation here. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet. Passengers shifted nervously as he moved down the aisle toward the cockpit. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of the responsibility that had suddenly fallen onto him. Flight attendants stepped aside respectfully, recognizing the quiet determination in his eyes. He wasn't a tourist or a regular passenger. Something about him commanded attention without a word. As he reached the cockpit, the captain looked up with a mixture of relief and urgency. "Thank God," he said quietly, as if he had been holding his breath for this moment. "I wasn't sure if anyone on board could handle this situation." The co-pilot glanced at him with hope in her eyes, their hands poised over the controls, waiting for guidance. The young man nodded, his training kicking in immediately. "Tell me what's happening," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension around them. The captain quickly explained that the plane had experienced a failure in one of its critical systems, making landing at their destination extremely dangerous without precise maneuvering. Time was short, and every second counted. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for just a fraction of a second to center himself. Then, with meticulous care, he began to assess the situation. He asked the captain specific questions about the instruments, the altitude, and the state of the engines. Each answer allowed him to form a clear picture of the challenge ahead. His military training had taught him to think logically, to anticipate problems before they occurred, and to remain calm under pressure. Now, all of that knowledge was needed in the skies. Meanwhile, the passengers were beginning to understand that something serious was happening. The flight attendants moved quickly, reassuring them while maintaining strict professionalism. Some passengers whispered prayers. Others gripped their seats tightly, their knuckles white. A few tried to make light conversation, but the tension in the cabin was undeniable. Yet, there was also a quiet fascination. People were beginning to notice that the young man in 11D was no ordinary passenger. There was a presence about him, a sense of confidence that contrasted sharply with the fear around him. The young man spoke calmly to the captain, offering precise instructions. "We need to stabilize the plane at this altitude first," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Check the hydraulic system and adjust the flaps gradually. We can't make sudden moves. Keep the descent slow and steady. I'll help with navigation." His words were clear, concise, and authoritative, a stark contrast to the panic that had begun to spread in the cabin. As he worked with the pilots, the passengers began to sense a shift. Some watched from the windows, noticing how the plane moved carefully, steadily, rather than the erratic motions that usually accompany emergencies. Others turned toward the cockpit, craning their necks, sensing that someone in there was taking control, someone capable of keeping them safe. The young man's calmness became contagious, bringing a small measure of reassurance to those around him. Outside, the sky remained the same serene expanse of clouds, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the cabin. But inside, the atmosphere was electric. The young man guided the captain through a series of maneuvers designed to stabilize the aircraft and prepare it for an emergency landing. He drew on his training constantly, recalling simulations, experiences, and moments of extreme pressure from his past missions. Every decision had to be precise, every command carefully measured. There was no room for error. As the minutes passed, the passengers began to notice that the turbulence was lessening. The alarms were still audible, but the plane's movements were smoother. A mother clutched her child, whispering quietly, but there was a sense of hope in her eyes now. The young man's presence, though largely unseen, had a calming effect on everyone. His focus and quiet authority were like a shield against panic, holding the situation together with invisible hands. Inside the cockpit, the team worked in silence, punctuated only by the soft beeps of instruments and the young man's calm instructions. The tension was palpable, but there was also a growing sense of control. He guided the plane through the necessary adjustments, monitoring altitude, speed, and engine performance. Every second mattered, and he never allowed himself to lose focus for even a moment. Back in the cabin, the passengers began to notice small signs that things were improving. The shaking had lessened, the lights had stopped flickering, and the air of panic was gradually replaced by cautious optimism. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing that someone had stepped forward to prevent disaster. Others stared in quiet awe, still unsure of what exactly had happened, but feeling that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The young man remained composed, aware of every detail and prepared for every possibility. He knew that the plane was not yet out of danger. The landing would be critical, and they would need to maintain absolute precision. But for the first time since the alarm had sounded, he felt a measure of confidence. He had trained for moments like this his entire life, and now his training was saving lives in the most unexpected way. The captain glanced at him, a mix of gratitude and relief in his eyes. "We couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly. The young man shook his head, refusing to accept praise. "We do what we have to do," he replied simply. His focus never wavered. Every passenger's safety depended on him, and he was determined to honor that responsibility completely. As the plane continued its journey, slowly descending toward the airport, the young man in 11D became more than a passenger. He was a leader, a guide, and a source of calm in a moment of extreme danger. Passengers began to whisper, sharing what they had overheard about the combat pilot helping the captain. Their fear was slowly being replaced by awe and hope. They did not know his name, but they understood that someone ordinary among them had become extraordinary when the situation demanded it. Minutes felt like hours, and every movement of the plane was crucial. The young man coordinated with the flight crew, anticipating challenges, calculating risks, and maintaining steady communication. Outside, the sky remained beautiful and calm, a stark contrast to the intensity inside the cabin. He reminded himself to stay focused, to ignore distractions, and to continue guiding the plane safely to its destination. The tension in the cabin gradually shifted from fear to anticipation. Passengers clutched their seats tightly, but there were glimmers of hope. Children stopped crying, and adults whispered prayers of gratitude. Every eye in the plane seemed to turn toward the cockpit, drawn by the invisible force of competence and calm emanating from the young man in 11D. He remained focused, every decision deliberate, every instruction precise. The situation was still dangerous, but the plane was no longer out of control. For the first time since the alarm, there was a sense that survival was not only possible but likely. The young man's presence had transformed the atmosphere from one of panic to one of cautious determination. The plane was no longer just a vehicle carrying passengers. It had become a place of silent tension, where every sound, every movement, and every decision mattered. The young man in 11D remained at the cockpit door, a steady presence guiding the pilots through the emergency. Outside, the sky was a calm sea of clouds, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions inside. But calm appearances could be deceiving. The real danger lay in the mechanics of the aircraft, and every second brought new challenges. The captain spoke quietly, his voice tight with focus. "We need to stabilize the landing approach. The instruments show limited control over the flaps and landing gear. We have to take it slow." The young man nodded without hesitation, his mind already running through the series of precise actions required to achieve a safe landing. Years of training, split-second decisions, and countless simulations converged in this moment. "Altitude is decreasing too fast," "We need to balance it immediately," he said firmly. His hands gestured to the co-pilot guiding adjustments, while his eyes scanned the instrument panels, noting every fluctuation in speed, pressure, and system status. The co-pilot followed his instructions precisely, trusting the calm authority in his voice. The young man's experience was visible in every measured step, every careful calculation. Back in the cabin, passengers could feel the subtle changes. The plane's movements, once unpredictable and jerky, had become smoother, deliberate. But the tension was still palpable. A mother clutched her child tightly, whispering quiet reassurances. An elderly man held the armrest with white-knuckled hands, his knuckles tapping nervously. A young couple exchanged worried glances, silently communicating their fear. Everyone could sense that someone was steering the plane toward safety, though few knew exactly how. The young man continued giving instructions, each one precise and calculated. Slow descent. Keep engines steady, adjust flaps gradually, check the hydraulic levels constantly. We can't afford sudden movements. His voice remained calm, almost soothing, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. The pilots followed every command, the tension in the cockpit shifting slightly from uncertainty to controlled focus. Moments stretched into long minutes. Outside, the plane glided over a patchwork of clouds, but inside, every second was heavy with responsibility. The young man's mind worked rapidly, calculating angles, anticipating potential problems, and preparing solutions for every possibility. He had faced danger before, yes, but nothing quite like this. An entire aircraft filled with civilians depending on him to remain calm, to act precisely, and to ensure their survival. "Steady now," he instructed. "We're approaching the first checkpoint. Maintain altitude." Slight adjustment to the left. Slow, careful, steady. The co-pilot followed his directions flawlessly, and the plane responded. The subtle shift in movement was reassuring, a small victory in a situation that still demanded extreme caution. Meanwhile, passengers had begun to notice that the worst seemed to be over. The shaking had lessened, and the alarms were less frequent. Some whispered quietly to one another, sharing their observations. "I think someone is helping the pilots," one woman said softly, clutching her husband's arm. "Did you hear the announcement about a combat pilot?" he replied, eyes wide with awe. The young man in 11D remained mostly unseen, yet the ripples of hope and admiration began to spread throughout the cabin. The young man took a moment to center himself, breathing deeply, feeling the familiar adrenaline mix with focus. He remembered his training, the countless hours in simulators, the real-life missions where every decision had mattered. That discipline, that ability to stay calm under pressure, was now keeping the plane steady. Every second, every tiny adjustment mattered. A small error could be catastrophic, but every correct action brought them closer to safety. "Hydraulics are stabilizing," he said, noting the improved response of the flaps. "Good, keep monitoring, but the immediate risk is decreasing. We need to focus on the approach and landing next." The captain nodded, relief evident in his eyes. The co-pilot exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. They were still in a dangerous situation, but the presence of the young man in 11D had transformed uncertainty into cautious confidence. The young man briefly glanced toward the cabin. He could see the mixture of fear and hope on passengers' faces. Some clutched their seats, still tense, but others were beginning to relax, realizing that someone extraordinary had appeared when needed most. He understood their silent gratitude, though he said nothing. Praise was unnecessary. Action, calm, and precision were what mattered now. As the plane approached the airport, he began guiding the pilots through the descent procedures. "Slowly decrease altitude, check wind patterns, adjust speed gradually. Keep flaps in partial position until final approach. We need perfect timing for landing gear deployment." His voice remained steady, every word deliberate. He visualized each step, anticipating challenges, preparing for contingencies. The cockpit was filled with a quiet intensity. Outside the windows, the horizon was visible now, the sprawling city lights twinkling below. The ground approached faster than anyone wanted, but the young man's calm presence kept the pilots focused. He calculated distances, speed, and angles with precision, guiding the plane toward a safe landing path. Every movement, every adjustment was informed by experience, training, and an unwavering determination to succeed. In the cabin, passengers watched the plane's descent with bated breath. Children were quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation. Adults whispered prayers, some holding hands tightly, others closing their eyes. Despite their fear, there was also a growing sense of trust. Someone had taken control, and it was clear that their safety was being prioritized with skill and precision. The young man's focus never wavered. "Check landing gear," he instructed. "Deploy slowly. Confirm hydraulics are stable. Maintain steady speed." Eyes on instruments, not the panic. The co-pilot followed his directions exactly, the plane responding with cautious precision. The captain allowed himself a small nod of relief, acknowledging the critical role of the young man guiding them through this emergency. Turbulence threatened to disrupt the landing, but he anticipated every shift. "Adjust slightly to the right. Hold steady. Don't overcorrect." Each instruction was executed smoothly, the plane gliding toward the runway as if guided by invisible hands. The tension in the cockpit was still high, but control had returned. The impossible was slowly becoming possible. In the cabin, whispers of admiration spread. Passengers exchanged looks of astonishment. "Did you see him? That's the combat pilot," one man whispered. "He's saving our lives," a woman said quietly, her eyes wide. The young man remained unaware of the attention, focused entirely on ensuring the plane's safe landing. As the runway came into view, the final moments of descent demanded absolute precision. The young man guided the pilots with calm authority. "Final approach. Maintain current speed. Keep flaps steady. Adjust angle slightly for wind. Smooth landing." His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of experience and responsibility. The plane responded perfectly, gliding toward the runway like a well-practiced maneuver from his military days. The landing was tense. Passengers gripped their armrests, some closing their eyes, others staring through the windows in silent anticipation. The engines roared as the plane touched down on the runway, bouncing slightly but remaining steady. The young man's instructions had been flawless. Every adjustment, every calculation, every command had guided them safely to the ground. Once the plane slowed and taxied to the gate, the cabin erupted into quiet applause. People cheered softly, some wiping tears from their eyes, others hugging the passengers nearby. There was a collective sense of relief and awe. A young man who had been quietly resting in seat 11D had stepped into an extraordinary role when the moment demanded it. The young man finally leaned back, allowing himself a small exhale. His work was done, the plane was safe, and the passengers were secure. The tension that had gripped him throughout the flight slowly drained away. He had faced danger before, yes, but the gratitude and relief of those he had just helped added a new layer of satisfaction. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering smiles and words of reassurance. Passengers whispered thanks, some even attempting to identify the young man who had guided the plane to safety. He offered only a quiet nod, his modesty keeping him from seeking recognition. For him, the satisfaction came not from praise, but from knowing that lives had been saved. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the airport. The day had begun like any other, routine and ordinary, but it had ended in a quiet miracle. The young man in 11D had been the difference between panic and safety, between fear and calm, between uncertainty and controlled success. As passengers disembarked, many looked for the young man, hoping to express their gratitude personally. Yet he remained modest, quietly retrieving his backpack and preparing to leave the plane. The experience had reminded him that heroism did not always demand recognition. Sometimes, it was simply about doing what was necessary, calmly, skillfully, and without hesitation. For the young man, the day was a reminder of the delicate balance between ordinary life and extraordinary moments. He had returned to the world of civilians, blending into the crowd, yet when needed, he could step forward and make a difference. The passengers of that flight would remember the sleeping kid in 11D for the rest of their lives, unaware that his calm presence and quick thinking had been the reason they were safe. And as he stepped off the plane, he allowed himself a small smile. Another ordinary day had turned into something remarkable, a reminder that courage and skill could emerge from the most unexpected places. Even from someone quietly resting in seat 11D, the plane had finally come to a complete stop at the gate. The tires screeched softly against the tarmac, and the hum of the engines began to fade into silence. For the passengers, the moment of relief was almost overwhelming. People sat frozen for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. Many had experienced moments of fear and uncertainty, but now there was only gratitude, awe, and a quiet disbelief. They had survived a situation that could have ended differently, and the calm, skillful presence of the young man in seat 11D had made all the difference. As the seatbelt signs switched off, passengers began to stir. Some hugged their loved ones tightly, others wiped away tears, and a few simply sat back, letting out deep, shaky breaths. The cabin was filled with a mixture of relief and astonishment. Conversations buzzed quietly with disbelief, everyone trying to make sense of the intense moments they had just endured. "I can't believe we're safe," one woman whispered to the person next to her. "Did you hear about the pilot who helped?" The young man quietly retrieved his backpack, placing it over his shoulder. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, checking on each passenger, offering smiles and gentle reassurances. A few people looked directly at him, their eyes filled with curiosity and gratitude. He offered a small, polite nod, acknowledging their unspoken thanks, but he said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The safe landing spoke for itself. News of the young man's role in the flight quickly began to circulate among the passengers. Whispers grew into conversations. "Did you see how calm he was?" one man asked. "He didn't panic at all. He just guided the captain and co-pilot like he had done it 100 times before." A mother nodded, holding her child's hand tightly. "He saved us," she said quietly. "I don't even know his name, but I'll never forget him." Outside the plane, airport staff and emergency crews approached, unaware of the quiet hero inside. The young man stepped off the plane along with the other passengers, blending into the crowd as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He walked slowly, observing the reactions of those around him. Some were still talking about the landing, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. Children clung to parents, wide-eyed and whispering questions, while adults exchanged looks of gratitude and admiration. Media personnel began to arrive shortly afterward, cameras and microphones ready to capture the story. Passengers who had spoken to them described the hero in seat 11D, a young man who had appeared ordinary, quiet, and unassuming, yet had stepped into an extraordinary role when it mattered most. Reporters called it a miracle flight and the calm that saved lives. The young man remained mostly in the background, refusing to seek attention, letting the story unfold without his direct involvement. He walked toward the airport exit, reflecting quietly on what had just happened. The adrenaline from the flight was fading, replaced by a sense of calm and fulfillment. He had acted without hesitation, guided by years of training and experience. The passengers were safe, the crew was unharmed, and the plane had landed without incident. For him, that was enough. Recognition and praise were secondary. The real reward was knowing that he had made a difference when it mattered most. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted him, a welcome contrast to the pressurized cabin he had just left. The sun had set, casting a warm, golden glow across the airport. People walked past, some still talking about the flight, others simply going about their lives. But he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a life saved, and a reminder that courage could appear when least expected. Back in the terminal, passengers continued to share their stories. Some approached flight attendants, asking questions about the young man who had helped. Others spoke to reporters, recounting the calm authority in his voice and the precision of his instructions. Many described the way the plane's movements had shifted from chaotic to steady under his guidance, emphasizing that his presence had been the turning point in the flight. The young man observed all of this from a distance, listening quietly. He had seen gratitude in people's eyes, relief in their expressions, and even a newfound sense of trust in humanity. The experience reminded him of the delicate balance between ordinary life and extraordinary moments. One moment he had been a sleeping passenger, blending into the crowd. The next he had been the guiding force that prevented disaster. Life, he realized, could change in an instant, and readiness to act was always essential. He walked slowly through the terminal, passing people who were still discussing the flight in hushed, awe-filled tones. Some were taking photos, others were recording videos, and a few were sending messages to friends and family, telling them about the young man who had saved the day. Despite the attention, he remained humble, almost invisible. That was his way, action without expectation of recognition. It was the principle that had guided him through his life, both in and out of uniform. As he reached the exit doors, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He thought about the passengers, each one with their own life, their own story, and their own gratitude. He thought about the crew who had faced the challenge with him, and about the quiet coordination that had led to a safe landing. And he thought about himself, a person who had always tried to stay out of the spotlight, yet had been called to step forward when it mattered most. The city outside the airport was alive with its usual evening rhythm. Cars honking softly, streetlights glowing, people moving about their lives. He blended into this world, a young man among millions, carrying the experience of an extraordinary day quietly within him. He reflected on how heroism could appear in unexpected places, often in ordinary people doing what needed to be done. Courage, he realized, was not about recognition, but about responsibility and action. Passengers were beginning to leave the airport, sharing their stories with friends, family, and reporters. Some described the fear they had felt, others the calm authority that had guided them through the crisis. Many emphasized the young man's modesty, how he had refused to take credit, focusing solely on the safety of others. Their accounts painted a picture of a person who was both ordinary and extraordinary, someone who could have been overlooked, but had become a hero in the most critical moment. As he exited the terminal, he thought back to the flight itself. The moment the alarm had sounded, the captain's urgent request, and the calm focus that had guided every action since. He remembered the fear in the cabin, the tension in the cockpit, and the gradual shift to controlled calm. Each memory reinforced the lesson he had always carried. That preparedness, calmness, and skill were invaluable, and that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges without seeking recognition. He walked through the airport grounds, the sounds of the city blending with his thoughts. He knew that the passengers' gratitude would linger, that the news would spread, and that the story of the sleeping kid in 11D would be told for years. Yet he carried no pride, only quiet satisfaction. The real reward was in knowing that lives had been saved, that chaos had been turned into calm, and that courage had appeared when it was most needed. Later that evening, he found a quiet spot to sit, reflecting on the day. He thought about the fragility of life, the unpredictability of circumstances, and the importance of readiness. One moment, he had been asleep in his seat, and the next, he had been the center of a life-saving effort. Life, he realized, was full of moments like this, moments where ordinary people could step forward, take responsibility, and make a difference. He thought about the passengers, imagining them returning home, hugging loved ones, and sharing stories of the flight. He thought about the crew, who had acted with professionalism and courage alongside him. And he thought about himself, recognizing that heroism was not about accolades, but about action, responsibility, and calmness in the face of fear. As the airport emptied, the young man quietly prepared to leave. He knew that life would return to normal, that flights would continue, and that people would eventually forget the fear and remember the calm and safety. But for him, the day would remain vivid in memory, a reminder of the extraordinary potential hidden within ordinary people, the importance of skill and calm under pressure, and the subtle but powerful impact of courage and responsibility. He stepped out into the night, blending into the quiet streets, carrying with him the knowledge that even a single person, calm and prepared, could make a difference when it mattered most. The passengers of that flight would remember the sleeping kid in 11D forever, unaware that their safety had been guided by someone who acted with humility, skill, and quiet courage. And so the young man walked on, returning to his ordinary life, yet forever changed by the extraordinary day. He had been invisible, unnoticed, and unassuming, yet when called upon, he had risen to the occasion. Life, he realized, could demand the best from us at any moment, and it was in those moments that ordinary people became heroes, quietly shaping the lives of those around them with courage, calm, and skill.